to Live from Prairie Lights. I'm Lindsay Park. This evening I'm pleased to present Sarah Kanouse and Nicholas Brown, who will show slides and talk about their brand new book, Recollecting Black Hawk, Landscape, Memory, and Power in the American Midwest. Stephen Hoelscher from the University of Texas at Austin says, through an original and highly provocative pairing of image and text, Brown and Kanouse explore the complicated legacy of white colonization of an indigenous world. Now called the American Midwest, that world bears the imprint of its previous inhabitants as filtered through the conquerors. The book's brilliance resides in the incessant questioning of that legacy, why it's selectively remembered and forgotten. Recollecting Black Hawk will change how readers make their own memories of this place. Sarah Kanouse's work has been shown at Documenta 13, the Banff Centre, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, Cooper Union, the Smart Museum, the Museum of Contemporary Art Detroit, UnionDocs, and in numerous festivals and spaces. Her essays have appeared in Parallax, the Journal of Aesthetics and Protest, Leonardo, Acme, and Art Journal. An associate professor of Intermedia and dean scholar at the University of Iowa, she teaches courses in video/time-based media and art and ecology. Nicholas Brown teaches in the American Indian and Native Studies program and the Department of Geographical and Sustainability Sciences at the University of Iowa. His research focuses on land, justice, settler colonialism, and the politics of indigeneity. Can you say that word?
Indigeneity.
Indigeneity, thanks. In the Great Lakes and Alberta, Montana borderlands. We're very pleased to have them here with us this evening. Please welcome Sarah Kanouse and Nicholas Brown.
Well, thank you all for coming out, and thanks Prairie Lights for hosting this inaugural event for our book, which very literally is fresh off the press. I came by last night right before closing and picked up a copy, and that was the first time either of us had seen the book. So we're excited to share it with you today and to kick off a little book tour here in Iowa City at Prairie Lights. So thank you, Prairie Lights, Jan, for hosting us. Thank you to University of Pittsburgh Press for publishing the book, and thanks again for coming out tonight. We're going to start out by reading the first few pages of the book. As you'll see, it's an unusual book, somewhat unorthodox in that it combines scholarly approaches and also artistic approaches, and so I think it warrants a little explanation. So we're gonna share that with you now.
And so Corinne, you can go to the first slide. I have one of the newer laptops that doesn't have its own remote, so we're doing it manually. Across 2 pages of a book, a pair of black and white photographs meet at the binding and nearly fill half the spread. They are wider than they are tall, landscape orientation, as word processing software calls it. The image on the left is taken from the middle distance, the frame nearly bisected. On one side is a van, headlights toward the photographer. On the other, a canoe sawn in half and crookedly propped against the tree. The half canoe is a sign, the bottom of the boat covered with painted lettering advertising the services of a business in Sauk City. Paddle the Wisconsin River, it enjoins. The sign promises canoe rentals, shuttle services, and sandbar camping, and another, presumably discontinued service, covered by duct tape. The single word Black Hawk arches above river runs at the top of the sign. The adjacent photograph is a detail of what appear to be canoes stacked upside down for storage. A decal near the tip of one of the boats links this image and the canoes it depicts with the business shown on the other page. Black Hawk River Runs, the decal reads, and it lists the same phone number as the sign in the facing photograph. Very close framing of the image makes the canoes fill the frame, suggesting an abundance, but the photographer focuses on the decal, where a 19th century Indian perches on his scalp lock, his familiar chiseled features confirming that he is indeed the renowned Native American leader and the canoe rental business's namesake. The caption below the image reads, Sauk City, Wisconsin. Beneath these photographs, a section header acts as another alternate caption. Kill the Indian, save the man, a boarding school story. The text that follows tells how 6-year-old Richard Acme came to attend the Lac du Flambeau Indian School in the late 1920s, a story that sounds for all the world like an abduction. The quotation comes from the May 2007 Lac du Flambeau tribal newspaper in Wewin, which ran 2 articles in that issue describing the boarding school story from a first-person or tribal perspective. The text makes no explicit or implicit mention of Black Hawk, Kanouse, or Sauk City. The photograph betrays no evidence of Richard Acme or Lac de Flambeau. Yet their position juxtaposed on facing pages places them in dialogue or confrontation with one another. Reading conventions in which images illustrate texts and words contextualize photographs press the viewer to make sense of the juxtaposition. What do Richard Acme and the Lac de Flambeau Indian School have to do with Black Hawk River Run's canoe rental? What links the experience of 2 men, Black Hawk and Richard Acme, from different tribal nations separated by more than a century and hundreds of miles? What really does Black Hawk have to do with Black Hawk River Runs anyway? The image-text pairing prompts these questions but does not answer them. By placing Black Hawk, a canoe rental service, the Lac de Flambeau Indian School, and Richard Acme in proximity, it suggests that they are related. The spread, itself in dialogue with other such pairings, leaves it to the viewer to sort out what that relationship is, or rather, what it might be.
Black Hawk was really Makatai Mishi-Kyak-Kyak, and his most famous river run was at Bad Axe. It involved no canoes. Instead, the starving, exhausted remnants of a band of Sauk Indians that he had led through Illinois and Wisconsin in search of food and allies streamed into the Mississippi River. They were desperate to make it back to what remained of their land in Iowa after months of dodging and skirmishing with government forces. Women held children on their backs or above their heads and tried to swim across. Old people, frail from 3 months of foraging and marching, waded into the powerful current. U.S. soldiers and state militiamen fired on them from a steamboat patrolling the river and from the tall bluffs rising from its banks. Hundreds of men, women, and children perished in the massacre, with soldiers scalping most of the dead and cutting long strips of flesh from others as souvenirs. Makatai Mishi-Kyak-Kyak fled the scene of the massacre and turned himself over to the army a few days later, a prisoner of war in his homeland. For years, the slaughter at Bad Axe was described as the final battle of the Black Hawk War, which was known in turn as the last Indian War east of the Mississippi. However, to call Bad Axe a battle or the conflict a war is problematic given the military's disproportionate use of force. The events of August 1st and 2nd, 1832 are more aptly named the Bad Axe Massacre. Moreover, Makatai Mishi-Kyak-Kyak's intention to return home with his people might be seen more accurately as an act of love than war. Framing the Black Hawk War as the last Indian war east of the Mississippi is equally problematic. It implies closure, the war is over, mission accomplished. This designation is another instance of the phenomenon of lasting, which Gene O'Brien identifies as a rhetorical strategy that asserts as a fact the claim that Indians can never be modern. Although its status as the last Indian war east of the Mississippi is technically correct, the Black Hawk War was obviously not the last Indian war, nor was it the last conflict over settlement and land in the Midwest. It wasn't even the last Black Hawk War. Ironically, the longest and most destructive conflict between pioneer immigrants and Native Americans in Utah history, which occurred 33 years after the conflict in Illinois, is also commonly referred to as the Black Hawk War.
In light of this historical context, the decision to name a river recreation business Black Hawk seems not merely politically incorrect, but also distinctly ill-advised. If the historical precedent were taken seriously, the name portends a less than happy ending for a leisurely paddle, analogous to naming your new seaside community Guantanamo Bay. So it is probably fair to assume that the business owner did not think about the Bad Axe Massacre or the bloody process of Western expansion when choosing Black Hawk's name and image, nor did she believe that vacationers and day trippers from nearby Madison would make the connection either. And why should they? Along the route roughly traveled by Makatai Mishi-Kyak-Kyak and his band in 1832, Black Hawk's name and image promote fitness clubs, subdivisions, churches, butcher shops, and used car dealerships, not to mention the municipal streets, parks, schools, and mascots that bear his name. In parts of Iowa, Illinois, and Wisconsin, it may seem like an easy way to name your business while expressing regional pride. But Black Hawk is not simply plucked from thin, if collective air, or rather, the collective air is pretty thick. As recent work in critical toponymy has demonstrated, naming is an inherently political act. Naming is claiming. Because the Black Hawk conflict is popularly known as the last Indian war east of the Mississippi, the constant repetition of his name positions this sleepy sliver of the Midwest as central to the nation's foundational narrative of westward expansion, even if most people remain a little hazy about the details. Often paired with an image of a stoic traditional Indian, the Black Hawk name evokes the same noble resistance that 19th century Americans romanticized as soon as actual Indians no longer posed a threat to their territorial ambitions. The historical markers erected over the decades represent the evolution of white America's psychic investment in the conflict at least as much as they describe the actual events that took place. The commercial and municipal uses of the name Black Hawk chart another kind of changing investment in the past as an admixture of myth, fact, illusion, ideology, possession, and convenience. Yet their overall impact marks an absence, the supposed pacification and removal of Native Americans, reiterated by historical markers, artisanal breweries, and credit unions alike. These practices weave an unreliable, highly ideological tapestry of collective mismemory through the surveyed, sectioned, and settled Midwestern landscape.
So this is one example of the image-text pairings that are sort of the core of this project, the core of the book. I'm going to explain a little bit about the content of the book and what all is included, but the bulk of it consists of these pairings, which we see as being in dialogue internally, in terms of the specific image and text that are juxtaposed on any given page or any spread, but then also in dialogue with other pairings throughout the book. So we're very interested in what kinds of relationships are suggested by these pairings and what sort of possibilities are opened up through these juxtapositions. So the book consists of approximately 170 of these image text pairings, which is why it is a bit pricey. And these pairings image text pairings are organized into 3 chapters, organized by state geographically. So starting with Iowa, there's a chapter on Wisconsin and also Illinois. And the photographs, for the most part, document the proliferation of the Black Hawk name and image throughout these 3 states. Over a period of a number of years, we've been out traveling through the region, taking photos of the Black Hawk name and Black Hawk image as it's circulated. And then these images are paired in pretty intentional ways with specific texts, which also come from a variety of different sources. So the project involved a lot of reading of historical documents, tribal newspapers, scholarly texts, including sort of very recent indigenous critical theory. It's come out in some cases just this past year. Government reports, press releases, so sort of bringing together a whole range of texts to put in dialogue with these images. And in so doing, we see the image and the text as sort of being in tension with one another, a productive tension in which they unsettle one another, and in so doing suggest a range of possibilities in terms of our own political imagination. As I have said to my students throughout the semester, some of whom are here tonight, this project, like others that we've worked on, is all about making the familiar productively unfamiliar, transforming familiar everyday spaces, landscapes, making them productively unfamiliar, unsettling, in this case, settled landscapes. Unsettling the quietness of possession. This is an idea that we've borrowed from the geographer Nicholas Blomley, who uses it to talk about settler colonial contexts in which we think about colonization as something that has occurred in the past, as an event from 200 or 300 years ago that is over. Mission accomplished was our reference in the introductory text. So how can we pull that event out of the past and understand it as an ongoing process, one that has evolved, one that takes many different forms, and one that can be engaged with and changed. And so our goal in unsettling the landscape and making it productively unfamiliar is to try and understand the ways in which colonial logics are literally sort of inscribed in that landscape. In many cases through historical markers, signage, street names, and so forth. In addition to the 170 image text pairings, which comprise the bulk of the book, there are a number of other things in the text as well, including a series of interviews with tribal officials, historic preservation officers from the Meskwaki Nation, from the Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma. There's a interview with the tribal chairman, George Thurman, from the Sac and Fox Nation in Oklahoma. And I want to share with you very briefly a few of his own reflections on Black Hawk and the legacy of Black Hawk as a direct descendant of Black Hawk. Let's see. So this is George Thurman's contribution. He says, Black Hawk's bloodline still lives in the tribe today. I make this statement as the principal chief of the Sac and Fox Nation, but I am also proud to say I am a descendant of Black Hawk, whose blood continues to flow into new generations in several families. As a descendant, my perspective about Black Hawk is more personal. He is a very real part of what I bring to the Sac and Fox Nation as its chief, and who I am as Sac and Fox. I have visited the places where he walked and could place my own footsteps where his had been. I stood on the banks of the Mississippi River at Bad Axe, where 183 years ago I would have been a target for the guns and cannons just for being Sauk. So many of our people died there. The massacre still echoes within us. It was a tragic ending. But I, a member of that same tribe, stood there at that place of ending and saw my people of today make offerings at the riverside. Black Hawk fought so his people could live. And there, where one might think it all ended for us, we stood, remembering our people in the way they left to us, and that is uniquely ours. Only a chapter closed in 1832. We are still here to tell their stories, our history, and to add our own, and we do so as Sac and Fox people. So that's just an example of the kinds of reflections or contributions that are included in the book from tribal officials. And I'm going to let you go.
Could you just advance to the next slide? Thanks. As we've tried to, as we worked on this project for a number of years, we've had the occasion to try to tell people what it is, and we often end up resorting to first saying what it is not. That it is not primarily about Black Hawk, nor is it about the Black Hawk War. It's less about these histories than it is an intervention into how these histories are experienced and lived, predominantly by non-native people in the Midwest and to some degree around the country, because we all have, all these geographies have a figure like Black Hawk and local lore that relates to the settlement of the land. What we want to do is to interrogate the disconnect and the perpetuation of the colonial logics that allow that disconnect between this history and our present day life, and allow us to no longer see how these processes are ongoing and how settlement and extermination didn't work, that there are native people who are here in our territories, that we share these territories, and that we need to make something like justice out of this landscape. So by exposing and trying to place these images and texts in relation to one another, we are continually trying to open up and question the certainty that this project worked, and allow it to be something that we can continue to make something else out of. So part of that is we use the term recollecting to describe our process. And we're interested in it because it has a double meaning. So obviously it's related to recollect, thinking, recollect. These are all photographs and texts that somehow recollect these violent histories and their continued contestation. But they also are about a process of recollecting and sorting through what we have to make something new out of it. We also talk about this project as a form of practicing landscape differently. When people have asked us what we mean by that, we mean that landscape is a verb, not a noun, that it is an active thing, and that we are all engaged in its construction and its production all the time. So as we go through the landscape and notice or not notice these things, we are participating in the coding and re-encoding of certain stories in that landscape. And we hope that this project will be to incite people to practice that landscape differently, to at the very, very least notice these instances of appropriation and recognize that how they might be reopened to make something different from them. Let me keep going. So what we're going to do kind of next, rather than continuing to try to describe this project in its negative, in its inverse, what it isn't, we're going to try to show rather than tell what it is. So we will be performing a few of these image text pairings and then talk a little bit about the origin of the project, perform a few more image text pairings, and then sort of see where we are in time and keep going. So do you want to start on 38? So I think we have another image.
Should be the first one. 38.
It's not the first one. There we go. Okay.
Hobby hitching post. If on a Saturday afternoon you're ever in the vicinity of the Quad Cities and you see 20 or more automobiles traveling in convoy fashion, it's likely to be members of the Black Hawk Hiking Club starting out on one of their regular bi-weekly outings. And even if it's raining or snowing, it might still be our auto caravan of hikers, for never during the 29 years that the Black Hawk Hiking Club has been organized have we canceled a planned hike because of bad weather. Our hikes have taken us to many of the beautiful forest preserves in our territory, the lovely wooded areas in the Rock River Valley, the Indian trails in our state parks, and several places of national historic interest, such as the birthplace of Buffalo Bill Cody. John H. Hauberg, Rotarian, 1950.
Blackbird's Ghost. Blackbird Bend is a thumb of land along the Missouri River. Only God knows who owns it. Then again, maybe not. If the land could speak, what would it say? That once it was inhabited by the Omaha Indians. Then the Missouri changed course. The land that had been west of the river ended up on the eastern bank, several thousand acres gone from the Indians' Nebraska reservation. Sometimes early in the 20th century, it came into the hands of white owners in Iowa. Tiring of white ownership, however, the Indians decided to reclaim the land in 1973. About 20 of them trudged to Blackbird Bend in sneakers and blue jeans at about the time the Lakota, not too far away, were winding up their occupation of Wounded Knee. But no one remembers Blackbird Bend, except the Omaha Indians, of course. In 1975, the Indians occupied the land for a second time. Then the lawsuits began, a decade and a half of court appearances, motions, briefs, trials, and appeals. And still the most difficult question you can ask anyone along this brief stretch of the Missouri Valley is only 4 words long. Who owns Blackbird Bend? Theodore Steinberg's Slide Mountain, or The Folly of Owning Nature, 1995.
Convention Center meeting rooms names at the casino. Many people wonder about the names of the Meskwaki Casino's new convention center meeting rooms: Meskwaki, Outagamie, Fox, Renard, and Red Earth. The easy answer is that they are all names this tribe has been known by throughout history. If you do any historical research on the tribe, make sure you remember those 5 rooms, because chances are good you'll happen to come across all of the terms in multiple translations and variable spellings. Every single tribe has its own name in its own language that it calls itself. In our tribe's case, the root words in our own language is Mesk, red, and Aki, earth, which becomes Meskwaki, literally translating in the English language to red earth. This name was given to us by our Creator. Then there are all the other names that other Indian tribes and European civilizations have called us in their own language over thousands of years that simply reflected how they saw us or felt about us at the time of initial meeting. Examples of other names we've been called by other American Indian tribes include Outagami, the Ojibwa tribe's term that they called us, meaning people of the other shore. At one time, the Ojibwa lived on the northern shore of Lake Superior and the Meskwaki lived on the southern shore. Come to think of it, no matter which shore we occupied, the Ojibwas always seemed to prefer being on the opposite shore from us. Kagewa, the Osage tribe's term that they called us, meaning hard to kill people. It's actually kind of cool. Tochiwaku, the Arikara tribe's name for us. We have no idea what it means. Beshtake, the Dakota tribe's name for us. We're pretty sure we don't want to know what it means. The first Europeans our tribe came in contact with were the French, not the English, who decided to identify us in the French language as les renards, which means the foxes in the French language. Much of our early history was written by the French in French, so no historical documents of that era record us as the renards. Historical documents of that era record us as the renards and not the Meskwakis. Later, the British came along and just borrowed the same French description, except they said it in their own language, referring to us simply as the Fox tribe. The Spanish eventually showed up and called us Rencor, which is either a corruption of the French word renard or it means what it really means in the Spanish language, resentment. A curious and somewhat amusing description that makes us wonder how our first meeting with the Spanish went those many centuries ago. Jonathan Buffalo, Meskwaki Nation Times, 2007.
Replacing. The sometimes decades-long campaigns to erect monuments attest to the commodification of memory, as Indian ways of memory-making tied to place and shared storytelling gave way to static objects produced in market economies whose meaning frequently faded over time. Absent the regular recitation of history embedded in oral cultures that fueled history tied to place, the meaning of monuments threatened to become unmoored from memory. Commodified memory making divorced from storytelling threatened to produce landscapes punctuated with statues, plaques, and markers whose meanings dissipated across the years, absent tangible connections made to them through storytelling. Jean M. O'Brien, Firsting and Lasting, 2010. So you can go to the next one. Yeah.
So we want to talk now just a bit about the origins of the project. We began working on this quite some time ago, 2007, which was the 175th anniversary of the Black Hawk War. And so when we initially sort of conceived of the project, it was in direct response to a series of commemorative events that were happening throughout the region that summer. So we've been working on this sort of very slowly over a number of years now, accumulating more images, visiting more places, talking with more people, reading more texts. This wasn't planned, but we were sort of struck this past winter when we realized that it was the 175th anniversary of the establishment of Iowa City. And to sort of think about this project as being bookended by these anniversaries, beginning with the Black Hawk War in 2007 and ending with the 175th anniversary of Iowa City. Not surprisingly, some of the reporting on the anniversary here, the Iowa City anniversary, sort of employed this idea of firsting and lasting that Gene O'Brien talks so effectively about. There was very little mention in the local paper, for instance, about the Meskwaki villages, which were located here at the time the city was established. There was very little discussion about why Iowa City is located precisely where it is, at this spot along the Iowa River and not 5 miles upstream or 5 miles downstream, and how that is related to the location of these villages, how it is related to the land cessions that followed the Black Hawk War. In some ways, the reason we are sitting right here today in this very spot is connected to the Black Hawk War. And it's those sort of ways of thinking about relationships between past and present, and also the future, our ability to imagine alternative futures, and how that is related to the connections that we allow ourselves to see between past and present. For me, this project has taken on interesting meaning given that I grew up in Madison. I grew up in a house that literally sits along the so-called Black Hawk Trail. I would go to Black Hawk Country Club to watch the 4th of July fireworks. I delivered newspapers in Indian Hills neighborhood. I rode my bike up and down Old Sauk Road and went to summer camp at Black Hawk Middle School. And so the sort of mental map of my childhood was very much saturated with this name, in some cases image. And at the time, growing up, I didn't know the history. I didn't know any of these things, and so it's been working on this project has been a very interesting one for me personally, just in terms of sort of coming to understand my own childhood landscape very, very differently, and also gaining a better sort of appreciation for the ways in which these subtle practices of naming really do structure the way we think about Native Americans, the history of colonization, and relationships between history and our present moment. You want to talk?
Sure. So I am actually from California, which has its own very different colonial history and present. But I moved to the Midwest in the late 1990s, directly to Champaign-Urbana at the beginning of what ultimately, or not the beginning, but sort of midway through what ultimately became the successful effort to get rid of Chief Illiniwek. And when I moved there in 1998, I think very few non-Native people were even aware that there was an anti-mascot movement, an anti-Indian mascot movement, and that movement really started or took off there, and I moved there and was really struck by the vehement, angry threat that non-Native people felt very, very often at the notion that they couldn't pluck this figure out of their imagination and turn it into a mascot, that might actually be dehumanizing, and that they needed to pay attention to that. It seemed like so beyond what many of my neighbors and my new community could understand. So I realized that there was a level of insecurity about one's status as a colonizer. They did not want to be reminded of it, and did not want to have to acknowledge the humanity of Native people, even 150 years later. So it was a very, very stark reminder that this is a raw nerve. I continued to live in Illinois for a number of years, and had my first job at Southern Illinois University, which is located not far north of the northernmost route of the Trail of Tears, which is very little marked except as an auto route. It's a place where one can drive along and sort of think about the Trail of Tears, but it is also used on a day-in, day-out basis by commuters. And we were struck by a quote from Phil Deloria that talked about from a piece called Indians in Unexpected Places, and that many of these settler practices of naming things after Native people involved the assumption that there would be no Native people to occupy that history, that extermination had actually happened and had taken place and was successful. And what does one do with the Cherokee driving a Jeep Cherokee, right? How does that Indian emerge in that unexpected place? And we began a practice of sort of going down to the Trail of Tears and looking at and documenting Cherokees, Jeep Cherokees driving along the Trail of Tears, both as an act of presumably largely settler appropriation of that history, but also the potential always within it of contestation of that. And we ended up making a short film that documented 2 weeks worth around the same time of Cherokees traveling along the Trail of Tears auto route. A kind of early piece of interested in using these mundane landscapes of the Midwest and these quotidian practices of settlement and unsettling them. So I think that was one of the origin points for us for this project. Working on this project for me, as somebody who came to this area as an adult, has been a really amazing and humbling process of getting to know this region and listening to it. So we write in our introduction, and then Dylan Miner, who's an artist and art historian, writes a companion kind of critical essay about the politics of listening and how to listen to place and how important it is to come to a place, to announce oneself as a visitor, and then to try to learn as much as possible about it. And that learning comes from a variety of sources, from observation in the landscape, from access to historical documents and discourse, but it also involves listening to other people. So in the course of doing this project, we met with a lot of people whose words are not in the book, then as well as the people whose words are in the book, and we're very grateful for the invitation, the invitation to continue that conversation and to include their words and quotations here. Do you want to keep going? Okay, so we're going to do one more round of image text pairings, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So 114. There you go.
The Menominee Forest-based Sustainable Development Tradition. The Menominee Forest stands as a monument to the foresight of our ancestors, who recognized the bounty they inherited. Today, because they acted as responsible stewards of these resources for future generations, we enjoy, cherish, and are sustained by the resources so wisely planned for and managed by them. Knowing that short-term sacrifices must be endured at times to ensure the long-term sustainability and quality of life, we strive to emulate our ancestors' discipline. To many, our forest may seem pristine and untouched. In reality, it is one of the most intensely managed tracts of forest in the Lake States. During the past 140 years, we have harvested more than 2.5 billion board feet of lumber from our land. That is the equivalent of cutting all the standing timber on the reservation almost twice over. Yet the saw timber volume now standing is greater than that which was here in 1854, when the Wolf River Treaty defined the reservation.
Mapled sugar deer and leek stew recipe. Ingredients: 1 tablespoon butter, 2 pounds boneless deer shoulder meat in chunks, 1/4 medium cabbage in thin wedges, 1/4 small rutabaga sliced, 1 large carrot in chunks, 5 leeks in small chunks, salt, 2 teaspoons fresh grated ginger, 1 teaspoon ground black pepper, 3/4 cups water, 2.5 tablespoons butter, 1/3 cup flour, real maple syrup, maple sugar, biscacone, editor's favorite recipe, Lac de Flambeau News, 2007.
Subjects of empire. Stated bluntly, the theory and practice of indigenous anti-colonialism, including indigenous anti-capitalism, is best understood as a struggle primarily inspired by and oriented around the question of land. A struggle not only for land in the material sense, but also deeply informed by what the land as a system of reciprocal relations and obligations can teach us about living our lives in relation to one another and the natural world in non-dominating and non-exploitative terms. Glenn Coulthard, Subjects of Empire, Indigenous Peoples and the Politics of Recognition in Canada, 2009. Yeah.
Okay, so I think now we'll stop. We have a bunch of other things that we could show you if people would like, but I think it would be nice to know how people are responding to what we've shown you, and we'd be happy to answer questions that you might have about the project, and just have a more open conversation now. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
Thank you so much for sharing your work with us. I have a question about the book form. I can sort of imagine an intermedia project like this And in some ways, it would almost be more familiar to appear online and kind of pull together text and images digitally. But even looking at your PowerPoint, which is obviously remediated digitally, there's like this sort of stark and printed quality to the images. And I wondered if you could talk about your choice to package this and bind it in a book and how that really matters to you as artists and how that could matter to us too.
When I think about this, I call this a project, not a book, because the book is sort of its current and most recent incarnation. And I think there's obviously I think there's a value in this particular form. But when we began in 2007, after sort of an initial push, that summer we self-published a book, more of a zine that was similar in format. There was also an exhibition in Milwaukee that summer with photographs, a video installation, and so it's the project over the past 7 years has sort of taken on different forms, and I don't know that the book is the ideal one. This is a debate that we've had on and off over, yeah.
Well, I can. So when we started this, I don't think Instagram existed yet. And the fact that it does, and that we're all used to sort of seeing long lists of images that are related only by virtue of our networks, right? They're not related thematically. They're not necessarily related, maybe temporally and through people that we know. It produces a kind of state of image as information flow, right? And one of the things I think the print functions as is it causes people to slow down and take a much closer look at the images and to try to dissect them a bit. So the opening of the book performs that a little bit by sitting with the image and sort of just dissecting what is happening here. What do these juxtapositions mean and do? And we are not, I think, at a cultural moment where people look at images that closely or that carefully anymore. And insofar as the book has caused us to slow down and to be a lot more intentional, I think it's been helpful for our project. And I hope that audience members have a similar experience of audience members. I even don't talk about it as readers, right? Viewers, readers have a similar experience of slowing down and looking at what is happening within an image and what is happening from one image to another.
I think it's a demanding text for that reason. We did an interview with the press recently where we sort of said that this project, this book, does demand a lot of readers because it is not straightforward. I think there is a slowness that is required to really engage with it, and for that reason we also hope that it offers a lot in terms of our ability to think differently about the everyday landscape.
Thank you. In the images that you showed us this evening, I think I counted one image with a figure, with a person. And I'm curious if that's representative of the images in the book, and perhaps your thoughts on which people may show up in the images, or questions around depopulation that come up in your image making.
That's a great question. So I think tied to that is the temporality of photographs, where they capture and monumentalize something that has already been. We generally did not take pictures of people. We took pictures of the spaces that people see or don't see as they go about their daily lives. I think one thing that we've been sensitive to and concerned about in the process of doing this is that we are all participants in this, and taking photographs of people who are participating visibly in the frame of the photo, in the production of this space, I think distracts from the ways that we also are visitors to these spaces and that we also are seeing or not seeing them. So we're interested in focusing attention on the built environment and because of the possibility of imagining oneself in it, noticing or not choosing not to notice. The question of rural depopulation and the creating a monument to rural decay or abandonment, I think is a really interesting and a good one. Several of the businesses that we photographed in 2007 no longer exist and are totally vacant. They haven't been redeveloped into anything. In the introduction to the book, we have we talk a little bit about the temporality of the photographic image, and we think about these as monuments of what will have been, right? Not in a nostalgic sense, but in a sense that the consciousness of the culture might be so transformed that casual appropriations of indigenous names and images no longer make sense. So there is I think there's a documentary function to that as well.
Just to add that I think there's in addition to thinking a lot about the relationship between past, present, and future, there's a tension that runs throughout the project, throughout the book, that hinges on absence versus presence. And I think the photographs, we tend to think of the photographs as documenting the settler colonial landscape. And a large part of that is absence. The myth of the sort of vanishing race, the vanishing Indian, is a part of what I think is communicated by this proliferation of the Black Hawk name. And so the sort of literal absence of figures in the images speaks to that a little bit. And of course the texts are sort of the opposite. They're speaking back to the images. They represent survivance, ongoing presence, a refusal of that logic of elimination, which I think is really pervasive in the landscape. There's one image. There's an interview, one of the chapters with Yolanda Pushintaninkwa, who's the former director of the language preservation program at the Meskwaki Nation, and there is a image that she included with her interview of the Meskwaki language tables, sort of an informal weekly get-together of adult language learners. And that's one example. There are a few images with people, but for the most part, they are absent.
More questions or comments? If not,
Should pass around some books to look at, because
the book is Recollecting Black Hawk Landscape, Memory, and Power in the American Midwest. Let's thank Sarah Kanouse and Nicholas Brown.